I'm Emily Richmond, EWA's public editor, and I want to remind you that the contents of today's webinar are under embargo until 12:01 a.m. on Wednesday, September 20th. Your participation in this webinar constitutes your agreement to abide by that embargo. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping items to go over. If you have a question for our speakers, please drop them into the Q&A box with your name and your affiliation. You can ask your question at any time, and we will get to them during the audience Q&A at the end of today's presentation. We'll be sending you a link to an evaluation survey. We're going to ask you to please complete it. Your feedback is very important to us, and it helps us to improve. Now it's my pleasure to turn things over to today's moderator. She's Pia Seres of Wired Magazine, and she's going to take things from here. And I'm going to disappear until we come back for the Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Pia. I write about technology, youth, and education for Wired. I am so thrilled to introduce our speaker for today and her organization's extremely timely work. From the expansion of schools providing devices to students to the explosion of accessible generative AI like ChatGPT, I think it's clear that it's more important than ever to be covering the intersection of education, technology, and equity. Luckily for us, Elizabeth has been an expert at that exact intersection for quite some time. Elizabeth is the Director of Equity and Civic Technology for the Center for Democracy and Technology. You may remember her as a speaker at this past year's South by Southwest EDU conference for EWA's panel on student data privacy as a civil rights issue. So today we're actually going to be leaning further into the idea of ed tech through a civil rights lens and actually grounding that with numbers by getting an embargoed glimpse at their annual research report. And without further preamble, Elizabeth, take it away.
Thank you, Pia. My first task is to see if I'm an expert and be able to share my screen. So here we go. Let's see if I can pull up my slides. All right, can you all see them? Great.
That was great, Elizabeth.
The hardest part of the webinar is over. Let's just be able to make sure you can see my slides. All right, Pia, well, thank you so much for that humbling introduction. If we haven't met, I'm Elizabeth Laird. I direct Equity and Civic Technology Project at CDT. I'll tell you a little bit more about what we do, but I want to just start with some framing comments for today. I have four before I dive into the research, and I'm going to start by thanking EWA for their leadership on this particular issue over the past few years. When I took this role in 2018, it was my dream that we would be able to have these conversations and that reporters would be interested. And so I am just so thrilled to be able to partner with EWA and share this information with y'all. Speaking of y'all, I also wanted to thank you all for joining today and for your work on this. If we haven't met before, I started my journey on student privacy and ed tech almost 10 years ago when I worked for the Louisiana Department of Education and happened to be a part of the In Bloom scandal, if you will, that some of you actually reported on. And joke, I was either in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time because the state passed the most restrictive student privacy bill in the country. And so I have been so heartened to see the increasingly nuanced and thoughtful coverage of issues related to student privacy and increasingly what's more really about what's the ethical use of ed tech. And just a shout out, I saw who registered for this, and some of your work is actually cited in this research. So thank you for all that you have already done, including making today's report out possible. The third thing that I'll flag is just a bit of a, I don't know if it's quite logistics, but the slides that I have prepared for you represent, what is this, when you add it up, almost 80 pages of work. So don't worry, I'm not going to read 80 pages of reports to y'all, but just know it's the tip of the iceberg. It also means if I don't have something memorized, I will get it back to you. I don't have all 80 pages memorized just yet, although I have 36 hours to do so. And then finally, I just wanted to introduce some folks who may chime in at some point, or you will see their name following this webinar. The first I want to introduce is Maddie Dwyer, who works for CDT. She is going to follow up this webinar with an email offering embargoed access to the full set of materials. Like I said, I'm just going to sort of skim the surface for today's webinar. So when you see an email from her, if you are interested in getting the full reports, just reply that you're good to agree to the embargo and everything will be coming your way. The second person I want to introduce is Kristen Wolfel, who is the author, the lead author on one of the reports I'll talk about today, the civil rights research that we'll be releasing when the embargo lifts. And then finally, I want to introduce Gail Vogel, who is not with CDT. She is with Edge Research, who is the organization we contract with to conduct independent third-party research. So the polling that I'll talk about was actually conducted by their organization. And so if you have any technical or methodological questions, she's available as a resource. All right, without further ado, let's dive in. So I'm just going to start with some introductions and background on CDT, just in case you haven't heard of us and what we do. But I'm not going to do that for too long because I think we're all here to talk about the embargoed polling information, as well as some embargoed legal research that we'll done, which we'll release in one package on Wednesday. When I talked to Pia and Emily about this webinar, one of the suggestions they had is to think about our research and how it might fit in with issues you might already be covering. So with a lot of humility, I will humbly suggest some ways that I have seen you all doing very good work on issues and how this research may fit in. I'll take it, for you to do with what you will, and then we'll close up with some Q&A. So I work for an organization called the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is headquartered in Washington, D.C. We also have offices in Brussels. We cover a very wide range of tech policy issues, everything from content moderation on social media platforms to national defense and government surveillance to election security. The team that I lead is about helping public agencies responsibly and in a privacy-forward way use data and technology to improve services for individuals. Most of our work is focused on the school systems. So the frame that I would offer when you think about the research that I'm going to show is that I think we really believe that this is a yes and. Yes, we need to find ways to modernize the delivery of services. Schools are not serving kids in the way that they need to. And it cannot come at the expense of their privacy and civil rights. And so the part that we're going to focus on today is really that last piece of as schools are deploying technology in new and different ways, as Pia said, all the way up to generative AI, how can we be just as obsessed with the ways that these can go wrong and how they might be harming students, especially the most vulnerable, which is where the civil rights piece comes in, so that we can try and avoid that and put in place some of those guardrails before it's too late. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to talk about the polling. So if you haven't read our polling from the past, feel free to find that on our website. Our most recent release from last year was called Hidden Harms. I just wanted to offer some background about why we do this work in the first place. This is the fourth year that we've been releasing polling data. We started by surveying parents and teachers. In the past couple of years, we've also surveyed students. And the whole purpose of this is to lift up the perspectives of those who are close to the effects of EdTech and how it might jeopardize their privacy or how they may feel it is potentially used in ways that limit opportunities for them, so that they can be part of the discussion where are oftentimes not a part of it, when arguably they have the most to gain and also the most to lose. So that is sort of the ethos that goes into our survey, is to try and give those folks some visibility and some air in the room to talk about how this is actually playing out in their lives. Some changes that we've made since our polling last year. Earlier this year, we released some qualitative research that was based on 20 parent interviews whose children had firsthand experience with student activity monitoring. And the experiences really ran the gamut. But the reason I mentioned that is because we learned a lot through that process of what this looks like from the perspective of parents when their child is flagged. So we could then use that to then inform the research that I'll talk about today. Last year, we really focused on student activity monitoring software. And so this is software that can do a range of things. It can track when a student is logging into an application. It can use AI and natural language processing to search for key terms and documents and messages. Sometimes it can even enable real-time access to what a student is looking at on a computer. So we're still going to, we still focus on that this year. So if that's why you came, don't worry, we'll have some new stuff for you. But we also wanted to expand the types of technology that we surveyed on, because that is the reality of what's happening in schools. So in addition to student activity monitoring, we also are going to talk about content filtering and blocking software, as well as Pia mentioned, the technology that needs no introduction, generative AI. And then finally, the other piece that is new, which I'll talk about more when we get to this part of the presentation, is that in addition to polling research, I'm also going to share with you just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to some new legal research with regard to how to apply existing civil rights protections to EdTech. If you're interested, we can share this with you as a follow-up, but here are the actual numbers for who we surveyed. I think what you'll care about is that they're nationally representative. So when you're thinking about, our sample sizes and how much you can read into these findings, we really did take efforts to be able to conduct nationally representative surveys of these stakeholder groups, which are students, parents, and teachers. And then finally, as Emily said, these findings are embargoed until 12:01 a.m. on Wednesday, September 20th. All right, here we go. Let's talk about the data. So what I'm going to do, just to orient you to this section of the presentation, I'm going to start with some overall sort of background and context setting, and then I'm going to go into deeper dives into those 3 types of technology that I talked about. But just to start the conversation, this year we've seen an increase in student privacy concerns among parents and students. You can see in those, we call them donut charts, parent concerns this year have gone up by 12 percentage points. And so if you look at the historical numbers, that's quite a big jump. And similarly, we see concerns about student privacy go up by 5 percentage points among students. We find that this concern is disproportionately high among students with an IEP or a 504 plan, as well as their families. So the special education community seems to be having higher levels of concern than their peers. And one point here that we haven't reported on before is we asked parents if they had been notified by their school that their school had experienced a data breach. And we found that 1 in 5 parents they reported that they had been notified that their school had experienced a data breach. So I know some of you all have reported on cybersecurity before, and one of the big issues is there's not a lot of transparency because there's no affirmative reporting requirement for schools. So as I'll get to later, I guess I'm scooping myself, which as a reporter is a bad thing to do. So please forgive me, I could never do your job. But if you are thinking about cybersecurity in schools and the pretty horrific data breaches that have happened and the ransomware attacks that have resulted in schools being shut down and very sensitive information being released online, here's a data point about the percentage of parents who say they've been notified and is likely driving the concern around student privacy higher. We do find that if a parent was notified by this, they are more concerned than other parents about student privacy. At the same time, interestingly, we found that teachers' concerns about student privacy have actually decreased, and they are at their lowest levels since 2021. They have dropped 5 percentage points from when we conducted this survey last year. And not only that, we found that we're not seeing a higher percentage of teachers report that they've received substantive training on student privacy. And so we see, while parents and students are becoming more concerned, we see teachers' concerns actually decrease and their training remain the same. So there really does seem to be a mismatch between where parents and students are at and where teachers are at, which is likely a reflection of the support and prioritization they're getting from the school. And then finally, in our full report, you can see we asked about a number of different types of technology, honestly, based on a lot of the work that y'all have done, of the ways that schools have responded and the way they might be deploying technology like facial recognition, cameras in schools, or electronic hall passes that track location. And we found that, none of these were zero. So to some extent, the types of technology that y'all have reported on, we asked in our survey. And so we're finding that as teacher concerns are decreasing and as their training is remaining the same, schools are using an ever increasing and wide range of technology. Okay, so we're now going to do one of those deep dives that I talked about. We're going to start by talking about filtering and blocking software. And so this is software that is intended to restrict students' access to certain types of content. This software finds its home, and the source of it is largely because of something called the Children's Internet Protection Act, which requires schools, as a condition of receiving E-rate funding, to block access to material that could be harmful to a minor. So it's probably not surprising that when you attach funding to something like that, we find that this technology is used in almost all schools. So 98% of teachers say that their school does use filtering and blocking software to try and restrict students' access to certain kinds of online content. So that wasn't particularly surprising. I will say the next two are more surprising. So we asked students, and this is something that we had heard anecdotally through some of our other research and through focus groups, that overly aggressive content filtering and blocking can actually serve as a barrier to completing assignments, even those that are assigned by the school and by the teacher. So we wanted to know, how big of a problem is this? And so we found that 71% of students whose school uses this technology said that it has made it hard for them to complete school assignments. And this is not just limited to students. In the full report, you'll see this is very much validated by teachers. 57% of teachers report the same phenomena. So, one of the things we wondered, is this just because students hate filtering and blocking and they want to be able to access anything that they want? While that there may be a degree of that's true, the majority of students and the majority of teachers say that this is in fact an issue. The other aspect of this, and one thing I should say too, when it comes to making a school assignment hard to complete, that is higher among LGBTQ plus students than their non-LGBTQ plus peers. But finally, another thing that we had heard anecdotally over the past year, and in fact, I'll say that the school system that I graduated public schools from was a target of this. I graduated from Katy High School in Katy, Texas. And they were the subject of an ACLU complaint because they were blocking resources related to LGBTQ plus things, including the Trevor Project. And so we wanted to know, how common is that? Is this, sort of a one-off case, and I just happened to go to a school system where this was in play, or is this a more widespread problem? So we asked teachers if they thought that content associated with LGBTQ plus students or students of color would be more likely to be blocked. And a third of teachers said that they do. That they do believe that that type of content is more likely to be blocked. And teachers in Title I schools, as well as licensed special education teachers, are statistically more likely to report that they think that their school does that. So I'll talk more later about how I think this fits into some reporting that is already happening in the field, and your wheels may already be going too, about some of the conversations about restricting materials in school libraries and how this is essentially a digital version of that. Okay, so student activity monitoring software. So again, this was the main focus of our research last year. And so what we find this year is that we have not seen a decrease in the percentage of teachers who report that their school uses it. It's stayed relatively the same. 88% of teachers say that their school uses this technology. We find that unfortunately, some of the harms that we documented last year have not gotten any better, and in some cases they've gotten worse. So 67% of teachers say that they know of a student who has gotten in trouble because of this technology. And you may be asking, well, what's the problem if students are getting disciplined for this? And one of the reasons that this is problematic is because the stated reason that schools are using this technology is oftentimes to keep students safe. And what they mean by that oftentimes is, I'm trying to prevent a student from committing an act of self-harm or an act of mass violence. That's how they've oftentimes defined the safety issue that they're trying to address with student activity monitoring. And last year we talked about how it was actually way more common for students to get in trouble because of that. And that is true this year. What we also asked about this year is not just getting in trouble for the alert, but one thing that we learned from the interviews we did with parents is that it may not be the alert itself is the reason that students are getting in trouble, but because of the way that the school handles it. So we heard a lot from parents about how the response process wasn't clear, that parents weren't in the loop. So we also wanted to know, is it the alert itself that is the reason that students are getting in trouble, or is it because of how they're reacting to the alert, which potentially implicates the process that the school uses to respond to it. So you can see here, it is really a combination of both. And so I really would encourage folks, if this is something you want to talk about, we put together some thoughts about why this would be and the kind of response process that parents would like to see that would be an improvement over what we see now. Another issue that we covered in the past was interactions with law enforcement. We still see that's happening quite frequently. So 38% of teachers say that they know, and this is all of students, of teachers whose school uses this technology, but 38% of teachers whose school uses technology say they know of a student who's been contacted by law enforcement. And that is more likely to be reported among teachers who work at Title I schools, as well as licensed special education teachers. So those teachers are reporting higher incidence of their students being contacted by law enforcement. So perhaps not surprisingly, what we're finding is that parent support for and student comfort with activity monitoring software is declining in both cases. And some of the harms that I just talked about fall disproportionately on certain groups of students. And so one group of students that really stands out that's being disproportionately harmed by this is LGBTQ+ students. So unfortunately, this year, we saw an increase in the percentage of students who say that they or someone they know has been outed because of this technology. We see a 6 percentage point increase over last year. So 1 in 5 students now say that they know of a student who's been outed because of this. Not only that, LGBTQ+ students are more likely than their peers to report that they were disciplined because of this monitoring software. And that's both for the alert itself, as well as how students responded to it. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, we're finding that fewer students feel comfortable with monitoring software, which is down 11 percentage points since last year. All right. And then my last, but certainly not least, deep dive is on generative AI, the technology that took us all by storm in the middle of the school year. And so it wouldn't be a survey if we didn't ask about this. What we really wanted to focus on in our survey, there's already been research done about generative AI and how it's being used in schools. I think for us, we really wanted to focus on what are the risks with generative AI as it relates to privacy or, ethical and responsible uses of it, and how can we name those so that school leaders can get ahead of them. So just to start with some context setting, 58% of students, according to our research, say that they've used generative AI in the past year, and that can be for personal reasons or for school reasons. And this percentage is quite a bit higher among students with IEPs and or 504 plans. So remember that when I talk about students getting in trouble because of it. As far as teachers go, 43% of teachers say that they've received substantive training on generative AI. So the majority of teachers who we surveyed have not received substantive training on generative AI. And with all of that said, nearly half of teachers report that a student at their school has been disciplined or experienced other negative consequences because of this technology. And then finally, only 24% of teachers say that they've been trained on how to respond. So, what we've found in our research, which is not, again, not necessarily unique just to our research, but certainly is echoed there, is that this technology, there's a real gap between maybe what teachers perceive students are doing and what they're actually doing. And they're not really they haven't gotten the types of supports from schools to really help them make informed decisions. And so what it is creating is that students are getting in trouble. And that if you have an IEP or a 504 plan, you're more likely to get in trouble because of this. So I'm just going to keep powering through, and then Pia and Emily will help navigate all the questions that will come in. And again, I just shared a few slides. The full report, I believe, ended up being 40 pages, just that one report. So if you're interested in seeing the full thing, we'll follow up with you after this webinar. But I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about some legal research, which again is a newer type of research for us to release in addition to our polling research this year. And that research is on civil rights laws and what it means for ed tech and what it would look like to apply them with both longstanding but also emerging technologies. And so what our research showed last year when we just focused on student activity monitoring was that there are certain groups of students who bear a disproportionate brunt of the negative effects of that particular type of software, and that those groups of students fell along the lines of race, sex, and sex we mean to include the way that the Department of Education defines it, which is to include your gender identity and your sexual orientation. as well as whether or not you have a disability. And so we looked at those groups like, those ring a bell. And the reason they ring a bell is because they've been protected for decades against discrimination. And so the research that I just shared, part of it was about student activity monitoring, but we looked at 2 other types of technology too. And you still see this through line that there are certain groups of students, as well as their teachers, who should already be protected by existing civil rights laws, and yet they still are experiencing disproportionate and negative consequences because of the use of education data and technology. So that is why we set out to not just do the polling, but also look at the legal side of things and see how those things fit together. So these are the laws that we looked at. I'm not going to read them to you. I will say, though, that the Civil Rights Act goes back to the 60s. So in terms of long-standing legal obligations, this is certainly not new to schools. They have been required to comply with these laws and all of the associated requirements for decades. And I think that was part of our point, which is that this is not new. You have existing staff and infrastructure and policies. And how do we take that infrastructure and apply it to these emerging questions? Because I think they've been sort of kept separate, and the time is now to really bring those things together. And so when I talk about civil rights protections, I am primarily talking about on the basis of race, sex, as well as disability. This is another paper that is quite long. I'm not going to research or tell you about the history of all of these laws and examples of what they look like. I'll just introduce some of the key concepts. And then if folks have questions, we can talk about those separately, or if there's time, happy to talk about them today too. But the paper is oriented around 4 common civil rights complaints that very much are relevant and applicable, in our opinion, or at least should be asked how relevant and applicable they are to EdTech. And so I'm just going to talk through 4 examples of that now. And if you've covered this in the past, you'll be like, yeah. But I'll say, for me, I certainly learned a lot over the past year about these laws and what they mean for EdTech. So I hope you all learned from some of this as well. So the first thing I'll talk about is disparate treatment, which essentially means you can't treat someone differently on the basis of the protected classes that I talked about. And one of the things that we found in our research, and again, we looked at different types of technology and data that's being used in schools. And so one thing I haven't talked about yet is we did look at early warning systems. And so these are systems that analyze data and at the individual level attempt to predict various outcomes for students. And so one of the most common ones is trying to predict who might be at risk of dropping out. The theory being, if we can predict who might be at risk of dropping out, we can intervene before they actually drop out and get them the resources and support to keep them engaged in school. Our research showed that 58% of teachers say that their school uses this type of technology or this type of data analytics. But separate reporting, maybe from some folks who are on the line, have showed that these systems can actually include some of the variables that I just talked about in trying to identify who might be at risk. So they may include race, they may include gender, they may include disability status. And so these algorithms are taking into account those protected variables to then treat people differently. And if you're in a school, you would say, oh, that's because we're trying to help them. But per previous civil rights laws, that has to be very, very narrowly tailored to a very specific government purpose. And you should have evidence that it is doing what it is said to do. So something I'll talk about later. I would love to see more research and investigation into this about not just whether these systems exist, but how do they contemplate those protected variables, and what evidence do schools have that these are in fact achieving their stated purpose. The next type of civil rights complaint I'll talk about is disparate impact. This is shown throughout our polling research. This is where you may have a neutral policy, which is not intended to treat anyone differently, but that's what's happening anyway. So, I mean, if there's a theme of our research, I think it would be about how the different types of technology that I just talked about is having a disparate impact, whether it's Title I and licensed special education teachers reporting disproportionate harm, or LGBTQ plus students, or students with IEP or 504 plans. A lot of the technologies I talked about are based on AI, and they are also more likely to report negative effects of this technology, even if it's being deployed in a neutral way and the same way across all students. Another core concept in civil rights law is about a hostile learning environment. And so this is an environment where students are sort of disproportionately targeted. They're not able to express themselves or avail themselves of the same educational environment as their peers. And so one example that I'll offer here, and something that we've looked at in the past and Pia talked about, is with schools giving out devices and the strings that are attached to them. And this is especially problematic if you are only able to use a school issued device because you don't have access to or the resources to have your own personal device. And so one thing that we asked teachers this year is whether they thought that students who use school issued devices would be more likely to get in trouble for the use of AI, and half of teachers agree. So that's another place where some of these civil rights issues are coming up, especially when certain groups of kids who may be a child of color, may be from lower income communities, are more likely to rely on school issued devices. That their learning environment for those students is quite different than those who can essentially opt out of some of this tracking. And then finally, a core concept related to students with disabilities is free, appropriate public education. And one of the things that I hope you heard is that a student with an IEP or a 504 plan is more like that their teachers are more likely to say they know of a student who's been contacted by law enforcement. They're more likely to get in trouble because of how they respond to student activity monitoring alerts. All of those things can result in students being removed from the classroom and losing instructional time. And so if those students are being disproportionately flagged and being intervened in a disproportionate way, this could also be a potential violation of FAPE, which is specific to preventing discrimination on the basis of disability. So again, like tens of more pages behind all of this, I just wanted to introduce some of these concepts and how it fits into some of our research. So in addition to the polling research, what we're going to be releasing is the legal analysis that I just talked about, along with real life examples, and then also recommendations for what school leaders should do about that. Again, I'm not going to go into those in detail now, but my hope is that by raising awareness of these issues and calling out ways that schools can act on this now, and they already have staff who are dedicated to this issue. They've had to have them for a very long time. They already have policies on this. They've had to have them for a very long time. So how do they take some of the things that they already have in place and modernize them to the risk that our research, as well as some of the research that y'all have done, show is happening in schools? All right, we are rounding third. I'm almost done with the presentation, and then I see some, I haven't been able to look at it yet, but I see some questions and comments in the chat. So please throw those in there. Would love to hear what you're thinking about. So we don't just do research and polling to put out interesting information. Our goal as an organization is to ensure that technology is being used to help people and in no way be used to limit opportunities for them. And so what we're going to do this year is build on some of the work that we started last year. So last year, CDT, along with a coalition of partners, sent a letter to the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, highlighting some of what we found in our research about student activity monitoring and urging them to issue a policy statement on the intersection of civil rights and student activity monitoring. They have not done that. So we're back. And what's different between when we sent that letter last year and this year is that the White House announced a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And the Secretary of Education actually spoke at the launch event. And one of the things that the Secretary committed to was to providing guidance on AI in the future of teaching and learning, which they released earlier this year. When it came out, we looked at it immediately and found that it only mentioned civil rights one time. So in the 71-page guidance, and all of the things that I just talked about and the future of AI and what that looks like in schools, it talked about civil rights one time, and it was just in passing. So this year we are going to be releasing a coalition letter that will be addressed to the Secretary of Education, as well as the director of the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, asking them to fulfill their own commitment in the AI Bill of Rights, which talked about ensuring that AI is only used in ways that protect civil rights, protect civil liberties, as well as privacy. And so that part that's quoted, those are their words, not mine. And so our letter is intended to really highlight what this needs to look like in education, so that schools are grappling with this stuff now, and oftentimes they're already using this technology. And so what kind of guidance can they give to help them navigate this in a way that really protects privacy, as well as doesn't interfere with learning opportunities for students. So this is just an overview of what the letter includes. The announcement for the AI Bill of Rights actually mentions specific examples, many of which are substantiated in our polling research of what they want to avoid. So we have pulled those out, pulling in, a lot of the data points that I just shared with you to try and substantiate this is an issue now and requires action now. Putting forward what this guidance may look like with the different civil rights principles that I talked about and how they may apply to the uses of education data and technology. And then just reiterating our urgent call for action. And hopefully, this is an opportunity for them to lead on this, because they have their Office of Civil Rights and their Office of Ed Tech and their Office of Student Privacy. So to try and model for schools what it would look like for them to collaborate and put forward, robust guidance that really centers what students need. Okay, last but not least. And again, this is in response to P and Emily. I did not come into this saying I was going to pitch these ideas, but here are some ideas that what I think about, what I've seen various folks in education cover. Here are the ways that I think some of this could fit in, which again, I submit humbly. These are some common topics that I've seen covered. And so one of the things I talked about is disproportionate discipline and how certain groups of students are more likely to experience that. And there was nothing special about the research that we did. Anybody could have conducted that polling. Sorry, Gail. Anyone could have conducted this polling and research. It's just that we, took that step. And so how schools looked at whether the disciplinary actions that they take fall along different demographics, and are those demographics happen to be already protected, because so much of the discipline conversation in the context of civil rights has been about preventing that. And I think our research suggests that this is very much happening along the lines of technology in the same way it's happening outside of it. Another issue that I think could be interesting is how this plays out with regard to school safety. And so a lot of the technology you'll hear, some of the surveillance technology comes up in the context of this is intended to keep students safe. And so that's a big focus of the student activity monitoring research, for example. Another thing that we asked, though, was if a school uses predictive analytics to determine if a student might commit a crime, an act of self-harm, or an act of mass violence. 36% of teachers said that they do, that their school does this. And so that's in the full report. And that Title I teachers and licensed special education teachers are statistically more likely to say that their school does this. Similarly, I think we have a couple of data points in our full report about facial recognition technology and how it's being used in schools. And when it comes to how they're funded, there was a separate reporting done about the way that HUD grants were used to procure facial recognition technology, install them in public housing. And it was all in the name of keeping their residents safe, but instead they were using it to find residents, to sort of gather evidence to try and evict them. So I think there's also an interesting question here with the COVID relief funding, as well as with some of the funding that's provided under the Bipartisan Gun Safety Act. How is federal funding being used to procure this types of technology? The third thing that I'll pitch to y'all is the intersection with coverage around limiting access to materials that some people find problematic and harmful to minors, and a lot of people don't. And so I think a lot of our filtering and blocking questions would fit into that. And I am very curious about what process schools have in place to block this material. Is there any kind of input that's given to that? Do parents know what is limited by their school? And in a library, you can see is a book there or not. You don't have that same visibility to digital content. And then finally on this slide, issues around cybersecurity, which are becoming more of, unfortunately, a common occurrence in schools. And because, we heard from parents, 1 in 5 parents say that their school experienced a data breach. And again, schools don't have to affirmatively notify reporters or the public about this, that there could be some foiable information in here about what's been communicated to parents around this. Finally, and I think this is my last slide, early warning systems. So I talked about that already. I'm very interested to know, given how common they are, what elements are schools including in them? And do they include some of those protected demographics that I talked about? Do they include race? Do they include disability? Do they include anything along the lines of sex? And do they meet that very high bar of being able to say that this is a narrowly tailored government interest? And do we have evidence that is actually achieving what it set out to do? Because that is a bar to be able to use that to then treat students differently based on that criteria. With filtering and blocking, just more information about what's blocked and how. And we also have some research in the full report about it's actually quite common for students to use workarounds to get around it. So what is the efficacy of these systems? I think is a really interesting question. With student activity monitoring, this has been a focus in the past, but we see that 39% of teachers who school monitors outside of school hours share those alerts automatically with law enforcement. So this is an ongoing conversation. In the same way, there are debates about what should law enforcement present on school campuses look like. This is the digital way to invite law enforcement, not even just onto school campuses either, but into students' homes. And then finally with generative AI, which again, I know many of you are already working on, but I think our research shows that students are getting in trouble and that may fall disproportionately on a student with a disability. But teachers aren't set up to do this. They're suspicious because of all the hype around generative AI, but don't have good information or good guidance about how to detect when something is created by generative AI. And if it was done so in a way that is not allowed, what do they do about that? Okay, that concludes my filibuster around our embargoed research, which again will be public at 12:01 a.m. on Wednesday, September 20th. And with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen, P, if that's okay with you, so I can just see everyone's face, but I can bring it back up if there's something I want to show.
No, this is perfect. Thank you so much for this, Elizabeth. This was yeah, there's just so much to unpack in your research. And I just want to second Elizabeth in saying that Emily and I did in fact coerce her to come up with suggestions for stories, and they're great ones. I am particularly interested in making all of these sort of invisible behind the curtain processes visible to parents and families and community members, which is where we as reporters can hopefully come in. We have a couple of great questions in the Q&A side, and for that, I will kick it over to Emily.
Thank you very much, Pia, and thank you, Elizabeth. Just a reminder, folks, if you have a question, drop it into the Q&A box on your screen, and we're going to read these out. We're going to start with Julia James asks, do you have information regarding when blocks on content associated with LGBTQ+ students were put into place? Her state passed a law this spring that seems likely to make those blocks more common.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have that information, but I think this is the right question. I think that's what I was trying to say with this amounting to a digital book ban and all the conversations and attention that's happening around some people's efforts to restrict content that they deem harmful is very much relevant to what we see playing out, especially at the state level with some of the legal requirements, as you said. Next year, I think we can ask and start to see how this trends over time, but this is the first year that we've asked about it, so I don't have specific information, but I encourage you strongly to try and ask your school district about when these changes were made, if they were in fact made.
I actually have a question related to that. Speaking of book bans, what are some national or local or state level pieces of legislation that you're keeping an eye on that reporters should maybe be aware of too?
Mm-hmm. I don't have the full list, but certainly, the laws that are focused and targeted, targeting LGBTQ+ students and transgender students. And parents wanting to have more of a say in what content shows up in school libraries. And I think as an organization, generally we're pro parent involvement. A lot of the bad stuff that happens occurs because parents don't know about it and because schools don't have to tell anyone. So a place that I'm definitely looking to and that we're tracking are the state laws that really are targeted to LGBTQ+ and transgender students. And I haven't seen in the conversations about restricting access to materials, the same type of focus on the digital accessing materials, which is honestly how most kids get it anyway, as opposed to the library. And so that's what I would love to see more of.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The next question is from Maya Pottinger, and she asks, what are examples of behaviors or reactions students get into trouble for when you say they're disciplined for their reactions to being monitored? Great question, Maya.
Yeah. So I only have a couple of examples that we heard from parents when we interviewed them earlier this year when their child had been flagged. One, and this isn't necessarily one getting in trouble, but one example that has stuck with me is that they didn't tell the parent and they involved law enforcement before the parent knew. So that was certainly problematic. I don't believe that was an instance where the child got in trouble because of their reaction, but certainly an instance where I suspect most parents would feel pretty uncomfortable if their school responded in that type of way without alerting them. But one example was that an alert was shared and it wasn't shared confidentially with the student. So we didn't talk about that as much in my presentation, but one of the things that we found as a theme when we interviewed parents was that teachers didn't treat the alerts with the kind of like privacy and confidentiality that you would expect or hope. So in that particular case, the information about a student was shared with the classroom and they had a negative reaction to that. I believe they told the teacher what they thought about that, ended up getting in trouble. But I think the takeaway for me was that there's the alert itself, and then there's the way that schools may be collecting this information and are not particularly thoughtful about what it looks like to respond to those things. I think that's also true when you think about what's happening with these alerts outside of school hours, that if your school is monitoring outside of school hours, for almost 40% of teachers, they're just sharing that information with law enforcement. So I think, when it comes to student activity monitoring, it's not just the technology itself. A big component of this is how the school is prepared, or in many cases not, to actually respond to this in a fair way.
Elizabeth, I have a question. If I was a school district and I was looking for someone to help me put up these barriers to privacy concerns or to protect students, what is that job description? So for example, if I'm looking where my district's advertising for jobs, what are they listing? What are some of those keywords I would be searching for to see if my district's trying to hire?
What a good question. So this was not all part of my presentation, but last year we did a review of school district websites looking for this very information. As a parent, Emily, I'm sorry to tell you that there's not information out there about how schools are protecting student privacy, or even people with the word privacy in their job title. But don't fret. One of the first things that we did when we launched this project was to create a job description for what a chief privacy officer would look like, or how you could appropriately staff your agency. If you don't have the resources to dedicate a full-time person to answering some of the questions that we talked about. And there has been movement on that. We really, one of the articles that came out around the time that we released that report was how they were the unicorns of K-12 education, and that they were talked about, but they didn't exist. They're no longer unicorns. It is becoming a more common job. So I'm heartened by that. I'm pausing a little bit, Emily, playing the role of a parent, because a lot of the things that I talked about actually aren't privacy concerns. They are concerns about discrimination. They're concerns about equity. And that has an element of privacy to it, but it's really broader than that. And something can be private, it can be legal and secure, and it can still be a bad idea and not in the interest of students. So while I'm heartened to see that there are more folks with privacy doing, as part of their title, who are doing this work, the capacity needs to shift. And I will say that's one thing I was heartened about looking into civil rights, is because this has been such a long-standing commitment in schools. They're required to have people who are already coordinating around some of these issues. So it doesn't have to be an entirely new position. I hope it can be sort of a bringing together of what have historically been discrete and separate skill sets coming together to work to solve some of these problems.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to turn it back to Pia.
So Emily and I have one last question for you, Elizabeth, and Gail and Kristen and Maddie, if you want to chime in too, you're welcome to. But what is one thing that surprised you the most about the results that you've found?
The hardest part of this question is picking one. I'm gonna pick two if that's okay. I'll say within filtering and blocking, I was surprised at the way that especially teachers and students report that it is a barrier to learning, especially with how common it is. And I'm gonna cheat and say, as part of being a barrier to learning, also the way that some teachers report that this is a place for school districts to unilaterally and without public input flex their own subjective values on what they think is harmful to a minor, and how little discussion around that there has been, given how much attention there's been to what students can access in school libraries. I think the second thing that was surprising to me was with regard to generative AI was the role that it's the negative effects it's had on teachers in terms of their enjoyment of their job, being able to trust that the work that students present is theirs, and how that compares to what students say they're actually doing. So most students, very few students say that they've actually submitted, that generative AI work as their own, conducting plagiarism. And our surveys are anonymous, unless a parent is sort of standing over the child's shoulder while they do this. And these are high school students. They don't really have an incentive to not be honest. So the difference between the hype cycle of what people are talking about with generative AI and what students are actually doing, there seems to be a pretty big difference. And one that I think in some cases can create an unnecessarily adversarial relationship between teachers and students. And I didn't pick student activity monitoring because most of what we saw there, we saw last year too. So that was not surprising, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Well, we're coming to the end of our webinar, folks. I want to thank, I think we got one last minute question. We did. Adriana Gutierrez getting in just under the wire from the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. Nice work, Adriana. I was wondering how Elizabeth would recommend reporters go about finding a school district's activity monitoring interfaces. Are districts required to report the technology that they use to monitor students? Another great question.
Mm-hmm. I would love to, as someone who's done reporting on this, Pia, can I pick on you about how you found places that were doing this, and I can add on anything else I've seen?
Yes, of course. Honestly, I just reached out to school districts directly and asked if they were using any of these kinds of technologies. Another kind of offbeat way of finding it was on Reddit forums for school technology leaders who would just talk about it. And I do a lot of my reporting on like TikTok and Reddit and find folks there. As for whether districts are required to report the technology they use, what I've found is that districts will sort of mention it in passing in like the huge stack of papers that parents get at the beginning of the year, and not really go into the ways that it is used. That's my experience as a reporter. How about you, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think all of that is right. School districts should have contracts with these companies. And one thing that you could do is try and FOIA them and get access to them. Another thing is, if you have a contract, you could also see what's in there or not about the ways that they're protecting the privacy and security of this information, which I think is also quite interesting. And then just to back up what Pia was saying, parents are out of the loop with this stuff. They know the least of anybody. And you'll see that in our report that, we ask about the uses of different types of technology. Parents are always like much lower because they just don't know. And we did ask them though, what kind of decision making would you like in this? Because in our previous reporting from, I think it was 3 years ago, we did surveys, we did interviews with folks in school districts and said, like, this was something that came up, was what do they communicate? And we had some folks say, well, we don't want to tell parents and we don't want to tell students, because if they know that it's there, they'll find ways to work around it. So it's that question of efficacy. You can obviously what's problematic about that. And so when we asked parents, I think it was, this is where I don't have everything memorized. It was either 6 or 9% agree with that mentality of like, you should use it and don't tell anybody. So it's like very out of step with where parents and students are. And yet that is oftentimes what schools are doing. But I think to answer your question, there's no They don't have to tell parents that they're doing it. And not only that, the tools themselves, and this might be a little bit outdated because this is based on responses from the companies to Senator Warren's office. Only one had any visual indication to the user that it was even working. There's no, it doesn't show anything to students on their Chromebook or whatever they're using that there's something running in the background scanning what they're doing. So I think you could argue that in some cases, the lack of transparency is a feature, not a bug of the tool itself and the way it's being deployed.
And you absolutely can FOIA information on the kinds of alerts that schools have flagged and sent to teachers. And I see Mark is on this call and other reporters have done this to great effect.
Mm-hmm.
It's also just a great question just to ask a teacher. When you go for your annual training in the fall and they tell you about all the new bells and whistles that they've added to your platform, what are they telling you about things like this? And most teachers will be able to give you some insights into what they're hearing in the professional development side.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank everybody, and that's all the time we have for today. Of course, I want to thank Pia Series, of course, for preparing so beautifully to moderate, to Elizabeth Laird for being kind enough to share this embargoed report with our members. Again, remember, you're going to get an email from CDT with the full report, whatever you need, but it is still under embargo until 12:01 a.m. on Wednesday, September 20th. I would like to thank all of you for joining us here and for being part of this EWA webinar. There is an evaluation survey link in the chat box. Please complete it. Your feedback is very important to us and it helps EWA improve. We'll also be sending that out in an email in case you missed it in the chat box. If you want to learn more about upcoming EWA events, take a look at our website, ewa.org. I will remind you that the deadline to join our Reporting with Education Research Reporters cohort, a small cohort, it is a competitive application process. The deadline for that is Wednesday on the 20th. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, stop by your favorite app for your favorite podcasts and follow EWA Radio. We are back on the air. And if there's a reporter or a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line. We'd love to hear about that too. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Pia.
Bye-bye.